So this module is going to cover flow control. Most of you now have done through homework assignment 1, understood the basics with print and input, etc. But now we're going to use flow control statements. And the design behind flow control statements are going to be executing them under specific conditions. So right now you've just printed and inputted, but what most of you might be familiar with is if this, do that, or while loops or for loops, etc. That's what we're going to talk about here today. So when you're working with flow control, you kind of have these little diagrams like this, which is showing you a nice flow chart. You start at the beginning of your program. You then ask, is it raining? And then depending on if it is raining, you will either do some other set of instructions. For example, do you have an umbrella? If you do not, then wait a while for it to go. Is it still raining? Yes, circle back in a loop over here until it's not raining. Then you can go outside and end your program. So these flow charts, while seeming very simple, is usually pretty handy when you're first getting used to doing computer programming, especially when you're working with very, very large programs. It's nice to take the time to do these documentations so that you can go and reference them later on. So working with this, you have these quote yes or no's as you're going through that. In the section for this, you're going to see a link to diagrams.net. What's nice about diagrams.net is you can go ahead and create these little flow charts. I used to have this as a requirement that everybody submitted a flow chart. I don't have that anymore, but I would encourage you to go out and try to build out the program that you do for homework 2 here with the flow chart so that you can get used to understanding how your flow is going to work. All right, so the first couple things we're going to work with is Boolean values. So up to this point, you've worked with a couple different data types. You've had integers, floating points, and strings. Now we're going to add in Booleans. And with Booleans, you're only going to have 2 values, capital true and capital false. So capital true and capital false. The reason I say that is it must be capitalized just the first letter, and that will indicate to Python that it is a Boolean value. If you do this in all caps or you do this in all lowercase, it is not the same thing. So you definitely want to pay attention to your capitalizing here. All right, so what is this useful for? Well, when we do comparison operators here next, you're going to need to be able to compare 2 Boolean values. So if something's true or something's false, it needs to equate down or evaluate down to something. And you always go down to a simple single Boolean value. So with comparison operators, and these are your comparison operators, sometimes referred to as relational operators, but the idea is that you want to get 2 values down to a Boolean yes or no, or the equivalent true and false. So these Boolean ones here, notice that this double equal sign is equal to. Notice that a single one is back referencing to use assigning a variable. So you want to make sure that you're using 2 when you're doing comparisons. Not equal to, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. Now notice when you're dealing with some of these, you're only going to be able to do them with certain data types. So for example, numbers pretty much work, or integers and floating points work with all of these. However, if you're working with strings, then you're only going to be able to work with equal to and not equal to. You won't be able to do things like less than or greater than or things like that. So you can see those examples here where you're testing 2 strings and you equate down to true. However, if we try to test things like true and is not false, you can test that. But you cannot do is true greater than false. It would not work. The idea here is initially you would just type this into, idle when you're playing around in this basic command line interpreter. So 42 equal to 42. Now notice this doesn't work. Why? Because you have to have a double equal sign in order for it to test against it. So 42 equal 42. Now it's going to return either a true or false statement here. The idea here, and again, the big emphasis here is between a single assignment operator and a double equal sign for a equal to operator. This is the one where people mess up the most. So with those Boolean values, and that's what these are. So you have Boolean values of true and false. You have comparison operators, and then we have what are called Boolean operators. And Boolean operators are just three different kinds, and, or not. And these are used to compare two different Boolean values. So if it's true and true, then you get back true. If it's true and false, then you're going to get back false. And these tables, which we call truth tables, all show up here on this side. So for example, here is the and table. Note that the only one is true and true. If it's true and false, false and true, or false and false, it's always false. And so you want to kind of memorize these truth tables. It's not that complicated. With the not operator, this is going to be the exact opposite as to what's coming in there. So for example, if you say it's not true, you'll get back false. If it's not true, then it's false. So a couple of things where this starts to make sense is if you set values. For example, if I set spam equal to true, and then I can say spam equal true. Now I'm comparing spam, is it equal to true? Then I can also say not spam, which is going to give me back false because I'm getting the opposite of that value. So instead of dealing with true and false directly, because I assigned true to spam, I can then use these other operators. So if I say spam and spam, I'm going to get back true because that's the equivalent of true and true. Now, where these really start to make sense is when you start mixing some of these Boolean operators and then comparison operators. So for example, if we put these in quotes here, it's going to test 4 greater than 5. That's going to be false. And then you're going to get true here. And then and 5 is less than 6. You're also going to show that here as well. So those are both less than. This way you can test 2 expressions all at once. You can do multiple and you can stack them all together. So for example, here, it's going to stack them all together. Now, the reason that we use those is based on conditions. So if we're working in different blocks of code, for example, conditions, this is where you're going to take Boolean expressions and use conditions to get a specific context in a flow statement. When dealing with blocks of code, this is where indentation is important. So right now, when you guys are working in your scripts, everything's over here matched to the far left-hand side. In Python, when you're dealing with blocks of code, you're going to have tab indentations like this over here. It's important because those indentations mean something. So make sure you're using the tab key on your keyboard and not just randomly spacing it however you want. So the reason that we use blocks is so that we can have specific lines of code running underneath of a specific condition. You can have blocks within blocks, and blocks end when that indentation decreases to 0 or the containing blocks indentation. So how does that work? For example, here when they're showing this, we can say spam equal to true. Now we're going to use if statements. So if we just show this as an example, if spam equals true, print spam is true. And we obviously need to put that in quotes. And we'll have a simple else statement here that says print spam is false. Okay, so the reason this, and I'll get more into if and else statements later on, but the idea here is that you can see that we have our if statement and then we have a condition that we're testing. So we're testing to see if spam is equal to true. And if it is, then we're going to run this line of code. If this equates down to a false, in other words, this comes back as true, and therefore it's going to say if true, we're going to run this code, and it has to be indented. On the else portion of this, it's going to run the code that is indented here. And as you're working with the different flow control statements, you're going to have these indentations in here. Does anybody have any questions on this? As it's usually a sticky point for some new people.
So it's not like a bracket method, or you just can keep having, like, if you have like a block of like 3 lines, you can just indent 3 lines and then move on. Is that how that works? Or
Are you talking about underneath of the actual block?
yeah, so yeah, I'm only used to C++, and I know that we have brackets on that, but it's like, so if I wanted print, if I on the else statement I wanted to print another line, could I just do another line and indent that, and it'll just keep going?
So you'll notice when you hit enter off this last one here, it just immediately indentates until you are done with this particular section.
All right, so it just, you can just keep going until you intentionally want to stop the else statement.
Exactly. So if I want to intentionally stop it here, then I just hit backspace, give myself a space, and I can continue on with code, whatever I want to do.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
If you're doing yes/no questions, do you have to use Boolean operators to add like a capital Y, lowercase y, and then spelled out yes for each one of those?
You have to test for a yes or a no. So yes and no doesn't actually mean anything in Python, just true and false. So for example, if you wanted to catch input from somebody, I'm guessing that's where this is going. So for example, we do something like this where my name equals input. And we say, what is your name? And we're going to get rid of this guy. And then down here, we're going to test. So we're going to say if name equals Jason, then we can say something like that. Or if your name is something else, something simple like this. This is how you would test input. So if you get an input from somebody, you're going to test that input to see if it's equal to Jason. If it is, you're going to get this line of code because this is going to equate down to true. If it's anything else, you're going to get this line of code, and then it's going to go ahead and continue on. Now, you could have more lines of code, not just one here. You could do something else. You could test. You could do something. So, for example, if I got an age in there and we say age is greater than 4, then we can manipulate that age or print that out or however else we want. Note that when I'm doing this comparison operator, it's because input is always going to be strings. So I want to test against my string here. Going back to your yes or no, we could say, are you happy today? And you're looking for a yes or a no, you're going to need to test for a yes. And then you're also going to want to do a check for, or is my name equal to yes, in order to catch both of those, right? So that capitalization makes a difference. And therefore, you're going to have to test for both cases in order to respond back here. So we could say something like, I am happy to. And this one would say, I hope you feel better. So this is how you could test for yes. Is this kind of what you were asking for?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, for now, you guys will learn better ways of doing this here in the next couple chapters. But for now, this is what you would have to test for in order to test for that response. So if you type in anything other than yes in this form or this form, you're going to end up getting this else print. And again, we'll talk more about if else and other ifs and elifs, et cetera, here in just a little bit. But the idea is that you understand these are block codes that are inside of these conditional statements in here. And by me using an or, then I have to get this whole thing to equate down. So for example, if this is going to be true, or this is equal to true, then I'm going to execute this code. If I used and, then this side has to be true and this side has to be true in order for me to run this code. Obviously, in this case, there's no possible way this would ever happen because you can't be all cap or a capital letter and you can't be lowercase at the same time. It won't work. So you have to be careful when you're writing your code or you're trying to troubleshoot, trying to figure out why you can't get this to work. Make sure you're using and, or anything else in between there. So you have and, or not, if you want to do the opposite of something. Okay. So by program execution, we talked about this last week, where we're saving our Python files inside of here, and that's what you're submitting up to me. That's what this section is talking about. Which brings us to if statements. So if statements, we've already covered that just a little bit here. I'm going to do a side-by-side here that makes this a little easier. So for if statements, you have the if keyword, and then that's going to be followed by a condition. For example, we set one here. Then we have this colon. This colon is what indicates that we're working now with this block of code down below. So this next line has to be indented, and this would be a block of code. And this is going to be called your if clause. So whatever happens here only happens if whatever this is equates down to true. So for simplicity's sake, we're just going to go down to this option here. You also have the ability of doing else statements in there, which we have down here. So if this does not equate to true, then it's going to go ahead and do this catch-all or this else statement and print whatever line of code is here. You could skip else. Else is completely optional. So if I don't put this, then the code is just going to continue on running without us saying that nothing ever really happened. So there's times that you want an else, which is a catch-all, and there's times where you don't want to catch anything. You also have what's called an elif. So for example, I want to check to see if my name with a capital yes is here. We could also do a check to say elif print. And this elif, what we're going to test is my name equals no. And let's change my name to feeling just so it makes a little more logical sense here as we're working through that. Okay, so here we would say, I hope you feel better. And if they don't type in this particular one, then it's going to catch this down here. We can say something like, I didn't understand that. Now notice I was able, whoops, sorry there. Notice I was able to use this single quote because I used double quotes on the outside. If I use single quotes out here, notice that it changed from all green and then breaks up a little bit here. If I try to run this code, it's going to be broken. So it's either one, a good habit to use double quotes outside of here that allows you to use contractions in here. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But for now, if you guys want to do any kind of single quotes in there, contractions, etc., you'll want to use that single quote inside of double quotes. Okay, so if we run this code just to see what we have here. Let's see here. Just a second. Okay, so on this one, I went ahead and ran that code and it's going to say, are you happy today? If we say yes, then what happened in the program over here, if it was running a flow chart, this equated to true, and therefore it's going to print this particular line. Notice none of this other code got executed and it just continued. So we could put this down here and say, and that way, when we run it, we can see that everything else in between got skipped. So are you happy today? Yes. It said, I'm happy too. It skipped all of this code and then just ran this last line of code. If we run this again, but type in yes with a lowercase, notice it's going to come back with, I didn't understand that because it did not match either one of these cases. So we could have a Boolean up here that also had something like or feeling equals yes. Now we're going to match for both instances of this as well. You could also have another one in here and say or yes if you wanted to test for all capitals. And you would have to have feeling equals. That's another part that some people mess up is they forget that they have to have the feeling equals. They just try yes or yes or yes and don't put in the actual statements. Remember, you have to have a full condition in between these Boolean values. You can't just put yes, yes, or yes. Okay, so now we're going to check for all cases here. So if we run this again, we can say yes in lowercase. That worked. And we can test in all capitals. That worked as well. If we test for no, we could actually do this same thing inside of here. Now, again, we have a better way of doing this. We'll learn about this later on. But for now, this is the best way in your programs to test for this. We have feeling and we have I didn't understand that. So if they just type in a bunch of garbage, then we're just going to get I didn't understand that and in the program. That isn't quite as useful. That just means we didn't understand it. It would be nice to really sanitize that input. And so to sanitize those inputs, we have to use a different type of flow control statement. So we talked about this one here. We also can do things like numbers. So we have a feeling here, and then we can say my age equals input. What is your age? Go. And when we get this age, we can do some tests against it. So we could say if my age is less than 5, we can say something like you are too young for my program. Then we can have an elif statement that would say something like my age is less than 10, or let's do it this way, greater than 5, but less than, and my age is less than 100. And lastly, we can do an elif and says my age is greater than 100. And then we can have an else down here and say okay. So let's look a little bit at this code here. We're going to take an input here of age. We're going to check age to see if it's less than 5. We're going to print this statement. If it's greater than 5, but less than 100, then we're going to print this one. Elif, if we're older than 100, we're going to say we're very old. And then we have an else statement here for the print. Now, is this print statement down here, this else, ever going to happen?
No.
Exactly. So because of the way you've laid out this flow control, you're catching for anything less than 5. You're looking for things greater than 5 and less than 100. And if it's greater than 100, this happens. This else statement.
The else statement will happen if the age is 5 or 100.
Ah, good catch. So that's what I was hoping somebody would catch there. It would go through here. And the reason that if you caught what I believe it was Nick said here, if we say it's 5, then it specifically is going to fall in this gap as we go through here. So let's run this. So we have a 2, and we say I didn't understand that. Actually, on this one, there we go, 2. Now, this is what I was hoping you guys would see here. Remember that we can't just do a check here against 5 because any input that comes in is going to be a string. And so we need to convert that over to an integer before we ever get down here. Now, obviously, as you guys learned in the last time, we can just take int here and we're going to convert it to an integer right away. Remember that if they type in something other than a number, this is going to crash the program. That's okay for now. We don't have a way of fixing or testing that at this point in time. So we're going to try int and we're going to go through here. Now we should be able to test it. So yes, and then we can say 3. All right, so you're too young for my program. This is the end of the program. If we test the case that Nick was going for, which he just mentioned it early, good job, Nick. So if we say 5 here, note that you see this, you'll never see this. And the reason for that is we didn't use a less than or equal to. So you want to make sure that you test all of your use cases here for specifically what Nick was saying. So if we do this one, we would say less than or equal to 100. And now we've caught our instances. So if we say we are 5, whoops, let's try this again here. Hit the wrong button. You'll notice we hit that my program is too young for you down here at the bottom. So in your homework assignment, you're going to see something very similar to this, where you're going to do some ifs and elifs and else. In your homework assignment, you have to have something that is at least this big. In other words, it has an if, 2 elifs, and 1 else. Now you can have an unlimited number of elifs here. So if you want to test 100 of them, whatever your use case is, you could test it. So if you specifically wanted a use case where you wanted to see if they were 30 and you wanted to do something specifically for 30, then what we would do is test that just for purpose sake. Let's test that here and say elif my age equals 30, print okay. Now I'm going to run this. Does anybody see any issues with this code here? So we say yes, and then we type in 30. Notice that when I typed in 30, you're going to get great, enjoy school. I got this line. I did not get this line. Does anybody know why?
Because Python reads from the top down.
Exactly right. So when you guys are working with these conditions, you always want your most finite condition to be checked first. So we would want to move this condition before this condition where it would also get caught. Great work. So if we
Now, what if they would have typed in 30?
They did. That's what I did over here on the right-hand
Oh,
side.
shoot, I didn't see that.
Yep.
Okay.
So I tested.
Now, will that else statement ever be seen now since you put the less than or equal to?
It should not. No.
Okay.
Nope. So and that was going to be the next thing I test here. Great catch. So on this one, now if we say yes and we say 30, now we're going to catch our print statement here that says, "Wow, you're 30 years old." As he was mentioning there, we can't really ever get this else to trigger, even if we type something that is not a number. So if we type in junk, the program's going to crash. It's never going to hit this else. And the reason this program is crashing is because we are converting this to an integer clear up here. Whoops. And at that point, if we type in any garbage, it's going to crash this down below. So this would not work because this else statement is never going to happen. Inside your homework assignments, when I say that you need to have an if, 2 elifs, and an else, that else should be something that would be executed. So make sure when you're designing this flow statement to try to understand what's going on, that else should be able to be triggered. So you would want to leave some condition where it could potentially be triggered and actually execute the code. Otherwise, you're just wasting space and there's no reason to have that inside of there. But for the purpose of the homework assignment, I do want it in there. Do you have a question, Alex?
Would a negative number trigger it?
No, because that would fall up here with the less than or equal to 5.
I do have a question.
Yes, sir.
So what would happen if you put in like 2 numbers, like 30 space and 5? Would it crash it?
It would, because convert 30 space 5 over with an integer, you're going to end up breaking it. So for example, let's run that. You can say yes. And if we do 35, you'll notice that it breaks because it can't convert that string over to an integer.
Okay.
Now, what type of, how could you trigger an else statement if you've like covered everything that you want to accomplish with this less than or equal to 5 or greater than or equal to 5, less than?
You would have to design it to do that. So in this particular use case, it would not work. So what we would want to do is say anything up to greater than or equal to 100. And you wouldn't want to end this last if with a greater than is what it would boil down to. So you would maybe want to change this to a 50. And this one, you would want to do something where my age is greater than or equal to 50. Actually, it'd be 51 in the way we have this code lined out. But you would want your else to trigger where this wouldn't happen. So again, greater than is not that great to use there. So we could have less than or equal to 100. And then now we would have something that would be an else, and we could say so now if we run this and we do something like 1,000, you're going to get that else statement to work. Again,
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
I was saying thank you.
Yep, no problem. Great questions. I appreciate you guys interacting here, especially in this virtual side. It's nice to get questions like that, especially for the video, because people have these same questions in the virtual section. So I really appreciate that. In this case here, when your homework, I'm going to need this else statement. Now, in your normal code, you may want to, buckle this down to where there's no reason for it to ever hit the else statement. I'm perfectly okay with that. I just need one block of if, elif, else that triggers inside your homework assignment. You could have multiple blocks, but I asked specifically that one have one if, two elifs, and one else. You could do 100 of these different, chain blocks inside your assignment if you want. And depending on what you're doing, you may have it. For example, in our program here, this one we have if, elif, else. This one has if, elif, else. This one would work for your homework assignment. This one would not. Okay. I won't go specifically into that because there's a great video this week that covers the homework assignment. You will want to watch the fall one that's linked in our section specifically for using imports and the homework assignment. So I'm not going to cover that in today's video. We won't meet Friday. I'll continue the rest of this here, but we won't meet this Friday. You guys will just be able to watch that video and cover what you need for the homework. All right. On this while loop here. So now we're going to talk about while loops. We talked about for loops, or I'm sorry, we talked about if statements. Now we want to look with while loops. And what's nice about a while loop is it's going to execute code over and over and over until you get the condition that you want met. So for example, the most basic while loop is going to be while true. And that means we're going to be in this loop until we find a way to get out of it. Now you could do this a couple different ways. You could say X equals true, and you can say while X. And then inside your code here, you could update X to false, and then that's going to trigger this to come out, or you can use a break statement in here. This is the one I want to show you guys for right now, is just a simple while Boolean true. And then inside this loop, we can say print hello. And while we run this code, we say yes, we say our age, and then it's just going to print hello over and over and over until the program crashes. The reason that we want to do this is so that you guys know that if you get stuck in a while loop, you hold the control button on your keyboard and then hit C. And that's going to break you out of the while loop so that it's not running forever. So you'll obviously want to design this to where it's not going to get stuck in this while loop. We want some way to get us out of a while loop. So what we can do in this while loop is we can say other statements like, for example, spam equals 5, or if we say less than 5 is actually greater. There we go. And up here, we're going to say spam equals 0. And this allows us to finally control how many times we're going to go through this loop. So for example, if I have spam equals 0, and for every time that spam is less than 5, we're going to print this statement. What we can do down here is do spam equals spam plus 1. So every time we execute this block of code, it's going to take spam, whatever it currently is, and we're going to add 1 to it every single time. Then once it loops through, the moment spam is greater than 5, then it's going to stop printing hellos. So if we run our code over here, notice it printed over here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Once spam was at 6, then this kicked us out of the while loop and printed this last statement. So this is kind of nice if you want to roll through some other code a certain number of times, a finite number of times, then you would use this. Then you can use this spam equals spam plus 1. There's a shorter way of doing this. We'll actually learn this in a little bit, but you can also use a plus equals 1. It's kind of a shorthand way of typing the same thing. So if I run this, we have this over here, yes, 30, and then it's going to run the same code, but this is a little bit of a shorthand way of doing that same line of code. Okay, so that is what a while loop is, and there's a couple different things that you may want to do there. For example, we may want to do some if statements inside our while loop. So where this is nice is we're going to come back up here to our inputs. And what I always recommend now that we have a while loop is that you always put your inputs inside of a while loop. And you can do those inside of a while true. So for example, we can say while true. Then if I want to indent everything here, I just highlight this entire section. I go to format and indent. That keeps me from moving that. Another way of doing this is highlighting this whole section and hitting the tab key on your keyboard. And that will do that. If you do a dedent, which is this control bracket, it will dedent it back so that it gets it in the right section there. Okay, so with this stuck inside of a while true, we can now test for if this, then we're going to print this, but it's going to keep us in this loop forever. So let's take a look at that. So are you happy? Yes. Are you happy? Yes. ASDF didn't understand that. We have no. So we're getting able to print all our conditions, but it's keeping me in this loop. Nothing's breaking me out. So with if statements, which is what we have here, this annoying if statement, we'll talk about this loop here in a minute. What I want you to see is these breaks. So when we get to a condition and we print whatever we want, we would use a break comment to break us out of this while true loop. So we go here, we use a break, and that gets us out on this else statement. We can use a continue here, but it's really implied. So for example, if we get to this bottom line of code and nothing happens, it's just going to start over again anyway. So a continue in an else statement doesn't necessarily make sense. In your homework assignment, you want to use a continue loop. In other words, I need you to write continue in here. Even if it's already going to do it, like in this example here, I want you to put it in the right spot where you would want it to continue. So continue means that I want you to continue with the loop and kick you out of whatever it's doing. So now if I run this loop at the top, we're going to say ASDF, and you're going to get, I didn't understand that, and it's going to loop them right back to type it again. The only way they get out of this loop is if they type what you wanted them to. So for example, now I'm testing for a yes, or a capital yes. So this is how you guys can start to sanitize your inputs inside your homework assignments, meaning we are going to sanitize to only get the valid input that we want to get from that user. Now, this only works so well. For example, if we type in 30, this goes through and we get, I didn't understand that. That's fine. However, if we convert this my age one over to a while true, And instead of putting this int up here at the top, we can test this down here. So int my age, and this is the better way of doing it, by the way, is checking it this way. It's not going to matter. Let's do this now. So if I run this here in this while loop, let's say yes, and in this one I type in 30, and it says, are you 30 years old? Now notice it's going to keep me in this loop because I don't have a way of breaking out of this. In this case, it's going to bring it through. So let's do a break. This one's a break. 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 And then at this bottom one, we would say something like, I didn't understand that again. Now, most people would ask right away on this, I didn't understand that again. That may happen if the user doesn't type in a number, right? It should kick us down to this else statement. So if I type something other than a number, notice it doesn't work like that. So it's still going to have to run this line of code, just like you told me before. Python works its way from the top down. So the moment it tries to do this test, even if it's false, as soon as it tries to execute this test, it's going to fail. And therefore, to do a sanitization of numbers, you have to do something a little bit more than just a while loop. And so we'll talk about that a little later in another section. But for now, if you guys want to sanitize your text inputs to make sure that you're getting a valid statement, this is how you would do it. Now, on your homework assignments, and particularly on your midterms and your final, if you say, are you happy today? And it's usually smart to ask the user yes or no, something like this. That way you're telling them what you want them to enter in. So it's going to prompt like this. Now, obviously, we would change this look and feel here. For example, what I would do is I would, instead of using this inside the input statement, which I'm not a huge fan of, we go to this print statement ahead of time. And then on the input statement, we use the prompt, something like this. Whoops, forgot a in bracket there. Okay, so now you're going to get something like this. And if I type in yes, then it continues on the code and executes like we expect it to. But if I give them a prompt for a yes or a no, or we give them some boundary of something to type in, you need to make sure that that's what it sanitizes for. So in other words, if I say for yes or no, don't just do a if yes, do something, and then do else to catch a no or anything else. I don't want to see that. I want to see one for ifs on yeses, and I want to see ifs for nos. And then you should have a catch-all if it's all invalid input anyway. In other words, it's not what you were expecting it to be. Again, we'll sanitize for numbers here later on. Does anybody have any questions over this and how this works for sanitizing your text inputs? There's a lot of other reasons to use while statements, but the number one reason that you guys will want to use it here in the short term is to sanitize your text inputs and making sure the user is typing in what they should be typing in.
What about like at the end of the while true, do you need to put continue at the end of for the else?
Here?
No, for the other one. No.
No. So you really don't need one here, and you really don't need one here, because what's going to happen is there's no code beneath it, and therefore it's going to just continue and loop right back up to the top. But there may be conditions like here, we have conditions that are break, break, but we may want a condition that is a continue up here in the middle. It just depends on the use case of what you're trying to design. But for your homework assignment, I need to see a while loop that has a break and a continue statement. I'm pretty sure that's what the homework assignment asks for. Again, the video for the homework assignment will go in that in great detail. Anybody have any questions over while loops? Now, note, when we talked about this little annoying while loop, if we look at the code, we have name equals a blank, so there's nothing there. And we say while name does not equal your name, we say print, please type your name. We get their input, and then it will just keep them in a loop. Please type your name. Please type your name. Please type your name. Does anybody see while they'll be in this annoying loop?
It didn't ask for an input?
It does right here.
Oh, okay. Is there no break?
There's no break. There's no continue.
Don't necessarily need a break or continue here. You just need this while statement to equal false in order for it to kick itself out. Similar to what this spam number did over here. The moment spam was greater than 6, then it kicked them out of this while loop. If we
Any
run
name
this-
they put wouldn't match it.
I'm sorry, what'd you have?
Any name they put wouldn't match the uname.
You got it. So the annoying part of this is you're typing in your name, be it Jason or whatever you want to put in here, but it has to specifically match your name, the phrase your name. So until they type in, please type your name, it's telling you to type your name. This is what it wants here. So it's a funny little inside joke, but it stresses the point that unless you specifically match this case, I'm not kicking you out of that while loop. Does everybody see what he's talking about there? So you can type Jason all you want, but the moment name is now equal to Jason, which is what you're typing in here, it's going to say name does not equal your name. That's true because we put in Jason here. It's going to start it back over in this loop. And you could do something very similar here if you wanted to just test for one specific use case. That's where you could do this here. So you do while and then some expression. So you could almost do while, name is yes or no. You could do that expression in there. And of course, you're going to have to do equals equals for both of those. Similar to what you're doing here for this if statement, you could start a while statement with a similar condition. But you have to change a variable name before you get there. In other words, you need this name to equal something before you ever start. This is similar to C, where you have to specify that variable name before you ever use it, if you're trying to use it in your while expression. Otherwise, you don't really need to do that. All right, so we talked about breaking out of that. We talked about continue statements. You can also use continues, as we expressed here. So I'm not going to cover in more detail there. Let's see, truthies and falsies. This is just going to tell you a bunch of different numbers, and you could say if number, guess, etc. Which brings us to for loops. So the difference between a for loop and a while loop is a while loop is going to go indefinitely until this condition is met. So until this condition is met, I'm going to loop you over infinity amount of times. For for loops, you're going to set a finite number of times that you're going to go through that loop. Now, this can be a couple different things. For now, we're just going to learn the range command. Later on, we'll work with what's called lists in Python. For those of you coming from other languages, a list is similar to an array. So for this particular one, we're just going to use the range function. And so we're going to say for x, which means just a number. A lot of times you'll see for I. It doesn't matter what you use here. You're just setting a variable number, or I'm sorry, a variable name. When you get in here, you're going to have for I in range. Now this range command takes 3 different parts. For example, we're going to start at 0. And for now, we're just going to say 10. For I in range of 0 to 10, print my number is, and then we're going to do plus, and we're going to say string I, and then we're going to close our statement. So what does this mean? What this does is it's going to loop through this range, which this range is just create an array of numbers, and it's going to start at 0 and it's going to go up to, but does not include 10. So we're going to get 0 through 9 basically is what this range is going to give us. So for the first time through, I is equal to that, and then we're going to run that. So let me rush through. I know we're here at the end of our time here, so let me show you this last little part. All right, so the first time it went through the loop, it started at 0. If we want this to start at 1, we just simply change this to a 1, and it's going to go all the way through. Note that 10 was not included in this for loop. So a for loop is going to only run a finite number of times, whatever you tell it to run inside of here. You could also go over here and give it a third one, which is called a step. And this means it's going to step in increments of whatever number that is. So in this case, it's going to increase this by 2 every single time. So if we run this again, we can say yes. Whoops. Let's see here. Yes, 30. And you notice now it's going to go on all the odd numbers. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. That's because I started at 1. If I started at 0 or if I started at 2, now it's going to give me all the evens between 2 and 10. 2, 4, 6, 8. So there's a couple different ways that you can use this range command. The for loop itself is extremely useful, especially when we go over lists here in the next section. For now, in your homework assignment, this is what I want to see is just you use this range in some way. Where this can be beneficial is if you're building like a menu system or a bar or something like that, and you want to do a range, you can do something like that inside of here. You'll see this in the homework video as well. So that should get you through there. You can use the equivalent of while loops and for loops. So for example, like here, this is the equivalent of going through from 0 to 5. So this for loop is the same as doing all of this lines of code for spam. In other words, it's just going to go from 0 to 5, not including 5, and execute the code that's down below it. So if we actually copied this, notice that I can condense this 4 lines of code for this spam line, for if we actually get rid of that one, down to just 2 lines using a for loop. That range command, as I mentioned, you have a start, you have a stop, and you have a step. Remember that that stop there is up to but does not include, and that's important because when we get to our first quiz and stuff like that, it's going to ask questions based around range and different variables, etc. That's a key one to remember. Start, stop, and the stepping argument, which is going to tell you you're going to increment by. You can increment by 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever number that you want to pass in there. All right, that takes us to importing modules. For this week, what I want you to do inside your homework assignment or down below here is watch this video, imports and assignment 2. This is going to cover everything you'll need for the homework assignment. So again, no class this Friday, just watch this video. It's going to cover exactly what you need to see. If you want for additional things, you can watch this flow control, but I'm going to post today's video up here at the very top. Hopefully everybody understands that if you see FA 2020, this is a recording from last fall. I did have a lot of students respond to me that they would like to have last fall's as additional video content in case they're struggling what's going on. So I made that available, but I made sure to always put FA 2020 in the title and always put it at the bottom of the assessments so that you see the newer stuff up top. Anybody have any questions today? I apologize for ending this fast, but I know you guys need to get to other classes.
In the for loop, is it including for the second?
For the second, what do you mean there?
I mean like this, like the ending. Does it include 5? So would it go 6?
Would not. So remember,
not
the
included?
range command is 0 and up to 5.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Yep. So if you want 5 included, you have to put 6.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yep. And that's a key point to drive home here. I'm hint, hint, wink, wink. It's on a quiz. All right. I'm going to end the video here.